Hello and welcome again to Money Tips. This is Charles Kelly bringing you money tips to help you save, earn, invest, accumulate and enjoy more money. Now, I'm the author of the book, Yes, Money Can Buy You Happiness. And as I might have mentioned to you before, previously I've worked in finance. I was a financial advisor and worked for banks, building societies, insurance companies, and for myself for around 25 years. But I also had a business after that which was involved with recruitment of nurses and care staff from all over the world. So I've done a lot of things in my life. I've also been an employee. I've worked for companies, and so I've had quite a lot of experience in business, working, and also working in charities such as the Rotary Club and raising funds and that sort of thing. So when I'm talking to you often talk to you about things from my experience, and one of my experiences as a financial advisor was sitting down with thousands of people and looking at their finances, and I'll come on to that in a second. Now, at the moment, you might be listening to this tonight, you might be listening to this in 2 or 3 months' time, but at the moment, as we sit in March of 2020, every time you switch on the news, they're talking about the threat of coronavirus, they're talking about the threat of a trade war, or the threat of just general terrorism and the threat to the environment. Now, there will always be some sort of threat. So today the threat could be coronavirus, but you might listen to this in 3 months' time and it will be some other threat. Now, you've heard of have you heard of the saying strengths, the SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, right? You may have heard this old clever mnemonic. I can't remember the guy who invented it, but it's a way of looking at a business plan and then doing the SWOT analysis. So you look at your plan against the strengths of this plan, or the strengths of this idea, the weaknesses, so you examine those, you analyze those, and the opportunities that the business may have to grow, and then the threat. So you'd use it in the business plan, but you can use it in many other areas and in different contexts. Now, in reality, we are all facing threats. I mean, threats should almost be at the start of it, threats, but that wouldn't make up SWOT, would it? Make up it wouldn't quite make sense. But in reality, threats are the biggest threats to our business, if you like. We're always facing one threat or another. Even if you just go to work, you've always got a colleague who tries to undermine you, and they want your job, and they're trying to stab you in the back. I mean, I've seen this, this office politics. In business, you've got competition that really want to wipe you out. They want to wipe you off the face of the earth. They want to destroy you. These are all threats. Threats, people even employees who want to steal from your business. They want to steal your data, steal your clients, and thieves who want to steal everything you've worked hard for. I've had all of this. I've had employees stealing from us. I've had employees running their own businesses on the side while stealing our clients, stealing money from the petty cash, literally. So I've had all of this, and we managed to work through it. Governments and nations guard against threats, don't they? They have the security services, they have armies, they have anti-terror police, they have spies and cyber monitorings, like GCHQ, that are literally monitoring calls and emails. And many times they've caught terrorists before, whilst they're planning to do things like blowing up buildings in London and stabbing people. They've caught people through this monitoring. So they know what the threat is, and they say there's a level of threat, and they go in and look at that. So there's always things going on. There's always threats. And the difference between individuals and governments and larger organizations, that large corporations and companies usually do this analysis, and they look for what threats may be on the horizon or what threats could happen, and they put in place contingency plans and procedures for disasters and threats. Disaster management, you must have that. If when I was a counsellor, the council had a disaster management procedure and processes in place that they had to do it as part of their plan. They couldn't just say, well, it may not happen. If it happens, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. No, you have to have some procedure. The vast majority of us don't have anything like this, and most businesses don't even have this. They don't even have a backup of their data. Whereas many of these larger corporations. I remember when I worked for banks, they had a trading floor, and they would have another building with a mirror image of that trading floor set up and ready to go at a drop of a hat in a different building. Local authorities will also have a place. It could be. It doesn't mean they've got another building sitting empty somewhere. It could be that they've got facilities in another building to go there and set up if anything should happen, like a fire or flood or a terrorist attack on their building. They can move to another building and probably be up and running within a day, maybe that same day. All their data is backed up in the cloud, so they can go there, get the computers they've got, and work from that place. So they've got a disaster management system in place. As I said, many businesses don't even back up their data. So if their computer crashes, that's it. It's finished. It's gone. And let alone running their business elsewhere if in the event of a fire. Now, a lot of this has been solved by backing up to the clouds. Of course, I used to have a system. We used to have a system where it was tapes going in, and you'd have to run these tapes over the weekend and stuff. It took like 24 hours to do the backup, and then if they crashed, they wouldn't work properly. And in fact, our IT guy slipped up because the tapes weren't recording everything properly. And one day the server did crash, and we didn't have a lot of the data that we thought we had. We got most of it back. But, these are all things you've got to look at, especially if you're running a business. Now they're talking about all sorts of things. What are we going to do if the virus spreads? What are we going to do here? What happens if people can't work? What happens if you have to send employees home? And as an employer, if you employ people, you have a certain duty of care to your employees. So if somebody's coming into work and they're sneezing and coughing, you should be saying to them, well, you don't come into work. Or if they've got a cold and they've been advised to stay at home, you should be saying to them, don't come in, because you are going to infect other people. But if you force them to come into work, you say, well, if you don't come in, I can't do without you, and other people get infected, then that could mean you are, effectively spreading the virus by virtue of your orders. You could be liable if anybody else gets hurt. And the government today have announced that they will extend statutory sick pay to people, to give them the statutory sick pay from day one rather than day 4. But I believe that comes out of employers' pockets, by the way, so they're not been that generous as far as I can see. But the statutory sick pay is only about £94 a week, so it doesn't really go very far. So if people are not getting the people who get great sickness benefits are people who work for the government, of course. If you're working for local authority or the government, NHS, you can get 6 months sick pay. You can say, right, I'm going home to self-isolate, and they'll just keep paying you for 6 months. But that's not for most of us. That's not the case. Self-employed are particularly vulnerable, and when I was a financial advisor, most self-employed had no insurance whatsoever. You could try and talk to, you're blue in the face about taking out some sort of sickness policy. They didn't want to know, and most people didn't do it. In fact, a lot of companies discontinued the policies because they weren't selling. So this virus is a threat, and it's having an effect on the economy. So it's a threat to the world economy. Many of the central banks have looked at this already, and they've pumped money into the economy to keep the economy up so that it doesn't collapse under this sort of panic of the virus, which incidentally is only affecting a few thousand people compared to 7 billion. In the UK, it did jump up from 50 odd to 80 odd today, which is probably like a 20% jump or whatever, but it's still a very small amount of people in the country as a whole. Yet the government is still taking precautions, and they've got the chief medical officer, and they're taking precautions. What are we going to do if up to 80% of people did get infected? So they're looking far beyond what we would say, well, it probably passed by and it won't affect me. But they're thinking, what do we do if blah, blah, blah? And they've put emergency powers in place to maybe force people into quarantine, close off towns, close off roads. All these things are within the power of the government. And that could well happen. Right now, the media is pumping this information out so that we accept these things, because people, if you normally close off roads and close off towns, people wouldn't accept it. But now, apparently they've done a survey, and apparently 90% of people would accept it if they were told to stay at home for 2 weeks. And that is then obviously causing people to go out and buy stuff in I don't like this word panic buy. People are just taking precautions and making sure that they've got enough food in the house and enough loo rolls and medicines to last them a couple of weeks should they be forced to stay at home. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. We've just got to deal with it. So now a lot of people are also saying that that they can't manage money-wise, because if they were forced to stay at home, they wouldn't be able to, and were not getting paid, that they wouldn't have enough money to live on. Now, obviously, there's a lot of people who are vulnerable, that they may be single parents, they can't afford to stay at home, and that's a sad thing. But when I was an advisor, the basic fact is a lot of people just don't have any savings, they have no backup savings whatsoever. And the people that are the ones that say, well, I can't afford to save, you look around the house and you say, well, they've got the biggest TV, their kids have all got the biggest gadgets, they've got, I made a few notes, they've got mobile phones, the latest smartphones, and that they've got the upgrades, and sometimes their kids have got phones, that they've got cars on finance, they've got dogs like big bull terriers that eat a lot of meat, sometimes two dogs, and they seem to go on a never-ending spending spree of holidays, drinking. They smoke, a lot of these people, and yet they say, well, I can't afford to save. I can't afford to save for my pension, let alone putting money aside for anything. And they're the people who will be dependent on the state at the end of the day. And they're the people who say, well, I've worked 30 years, but I haven't got any money. I've got no money whatsoever. How is that? Why is it that people that I've met that earn modest amounts of money can still manage to save, and some people who earn more money than them say, well, they can't save? It's all about how you manage your money, which is one of the reasons why I wrote this book about money management. Yes, money can buy you happiness. So that's my little rant, if you like, about people who say they've got no money. Now, if this coronavirus gets sorted out and it settles down, is that going to be the end of threats? Well, obviously no. There'll be something else, and the newspapers will then be reporting another threat. So there won't be an end to this. So there'll always be something to worry about. Oh God, the planet, and that Greta Thunberg gets on the TV, doesn't she? So the planet is on fire. The planet's on fire. And then you've got these little kids saying, I want to save the planet because the planet's on fire. It's quite worrying for some children. They think, oh, we've got to quit school today because the planet is on fire. I've got to save the planet. Well, of course we know the planet is not on fire. Those fires in Australia were exaggerated on the BBC map, where they showed the whole of Australia on fire. I've got friends in Australia. They're not on fire. They're going about their normal daily business. So what I'm saying is that all you can do is just make sure that you prepare for anything, any eventualities. Make sure that you've got your own disaster management plan in place. It doesn't mean you're worrying that a disaster is going to happen. It just means that you are prepared in case anything does happen. That means having enough savings. Do you have enough money to last you a few months, 6 months maybe? Do you have enough money in the bank so if your expenses are £2,000 a month, you should have at least £12,000 in savings, or at very least a credit card that you can get that money on, and get by in those few months. Do you have that? It's saying that if the government did force people to stay at home, are you going to get paid by your employers? Many people won't. So, you've got to make sure that and this is not just now, this is any time, you should make sure that you've always got enough money in the bank to last you in case you lost your job, in case you get ill. And as I said, most people don't have any proper sickness insurance. 1 in 3, getting towards 1 in 2 people will get some form of cancer in their life, and yet most people don't have any form of insurance. They don't have any critical illness insurance. They have very little life insurance, and yet these are the threats. These are real threats that are there that will affect 1 in 3 of us. Maybe it's getting towards 1 in 2. We know from my old days in financial services that 1 in 4 people will not make it to 65. And yet people will say, well, maybe the state will look after people. The state doesn't. The benefits are minimal. So there you go. That's one thing you can do is to make sure that you've got enough money in the bank. I would always have a supply of food, in case of anything that goes wrong, in case you can't get out, you get sick, and this could be dry food, pasta, tin food, in the event of a shortage. Some people go to extreme. In America, they've got people that have bunkers and have nuclear proof bunkers, and they keep a year's supply of food. I think Mormons, the Mormon religion, that have massive cellars in their house, and they keep up to a year's supply of food, and their own members would be able to supply food in the event of a Holocaust or Armageddon or the Second Coming or whatever it is. But it does make sense to keep at least a week's supply or a couple of weeks' supply of dry food and that sort of thing, in case you had to self-isolate. And if you're in business, do you back up your data? Do you use the cloud? You know, most of our lives are on phones and tablets and our laptops now. So you've got to make sure you protect that data, because, you know, what about your passwords? Have you printed out your passwords? What happens if you lose the phone and you can't get all this stuff back? So make sure you're fully backed up. As I said before, large governments and large businesses and governments have this settled, and they have a place where they can go and work from in the event of a fire or flood. Then what's another threat are forms of liabilities. Now, we think of liabilities as loans and debts and that sort of thing, but liabilities can be things like, it can be excess debts, but it could also be things like standing as a guarantor for somebody who can't get a loan from the bank. So they come to you and say, oh, I can't get a loan. Well, what does that tell you? They're not really viable to lend to. The bank don't want to lend to them. They're not a good credit risk. And then they want you to take the risk by saying, well, can you be a guarantor? And that means if they don't pay their loan, which they probably won't, because they're not a good bet in the first place, you'll be liable for that debt. And I've met many people who have been in that position. Some people have gone bankrupt doing that. So look at those sort of threats. Look at just the threats, or the liabilities of not only taking on debt, standing as debt guarantor for other people, but every time you get in your car, you've almost got a liability, haven't you? I mean, I drove into town the other day and I got a ticket for God knows what. It's some violation, 50 something. I think I stopped somewhere to drop somebody off and I got a ticket, £65. So everything's a liability in a way. Everything you step out of the door, it's like a liability. So watch your liabilities. Be careful of letting liabilities sort of build up until you're at risk, and your whole economy, your internal economy, and your family is at risk because you've allowed liabilities to accumulate. It could be legal actions, and that's what, if you take legal action, or you get into a legal action, or you get into a legal problem, that is a liability. It could be a major liability. Again, you can insure for these things, but the best thing is to avoid them, to avoid having these liabilities. Now, governments and quangos are also creating many new threats to business all the time. More legislation, more red tape, taxes. All governments go, we're going to get rid of red tape. They never do. Changes to the rules. When I was in business, my biggest competitor, or my biggest threat, was the government, because they were always changing the rules. And in the end, they legislated us almost out of business with all the changes in the rule. Another threat coming up at the moment, that the Mayor of London, if you're a landlord, for instance, local authorities are always bringing in new rules. The Mayor of London, S.W.O.T, is planning in his election manifesto, he wants to bring in rent controls, or bring back rent controls in London. And that means if you rent a property to somebody, that rent can be controlled and you can't put it up. And and I think going along with that, they would probably give controlled tenancies like you have with the council. Now, this is going back to what they brought in at the end of the 50s, when you had these rackman landlords, these slum landlords. So they brought in these tough rent controls and tenancy controls, which meant that you could never get rid of a tenant. No matter how bad they were, they could stay there forever at the same rent. And in fact, as late as the 1980s, you could still buy properties with what was called a sit-in tenant in one room. And that house would be worth substantially less because there was a sit-in tenant on a controlled rent. And this is why in the 1970s and up to the 80s and up to the 90s, when they changed and brought in new assured short-hold tenancies, landlords didn't want to rent out properties. It was very difficult. You had to have special licenses and special systems. There was not the same availability of privately rented properties. It didn't matter in the 70s because they were still building council houses, but then there became a need for this later on because there was obviously going to be a shortage of places to live. And if Sadiq Khan brings that back in, I think that is definitely a threat to landlords in London. And don't think it will end at London, because if he brings that in London, then the Labour mayor of Manchester Andy Burnham might bring it in Manchester, and then what? What other cities will follow if he does this? So these things you've got to look at in your business. You've got to look ahead and see what are the threats, and that would definitely be a threat. Bringing in rent controls would send us back to the 1960s, and it would be, I think, it would be a disaster for the privately. It's okay if the government are, as they were in the 60s, building tens of thousands of council homes, which they need to do, but it's not okay if there's already a shortage of properties, and already 1 in 4 landlords is thinking about getting out of it because of the tax changes. These are other threats that have been brought in. I think that would definitely make it worse. So finally, like the old SWOT analysis, S.W.O.T, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, sit down and write out your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities and threats. Think of yourself as a business, if you like. You are your own company, your own corporation, and have a board meeting with your family and what are our strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, and then plan ahead for those with whatever measures you need to take, saving more money, getting rid of debts, having the right insurance cover, and so on. You know what you need to do, so go out and do it. So thanks for listening, and if you want to know more about how to manage your money, look at my book, Yes, Money Can Buy You Happiness. But until then, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for those people who tuned in on my podcast, but also to Leonora, Piero, Anka, Manny, and Salome. Thanks for tuning in on Facebook Live. Great to see you, and have a good evening. Bye for now.